Uh-huh. Dear ladies and gentlemen, does it work? No? I will yell. Everybody hears?
Yes.
Okay. So, dear ladies and gentlemen, warmly welcome here in Ptuj. Literally warmly welcome. Thank you for being here. And you have a good reason for being here, because with us is Toon Tellegen, a great poet from Netherlands, also famous in Slovenia and internationally for his tales for children, a medical doctor by profession, but he says we won't go into that today. But first and foremost, a poet. He wrote his first poem, so I've read, correct me if I'm wrong. You wrote your first poem when you were 15, and after that you wrote a poem every day. Is this correct?
Well, I wrote the first poem when I was 15, yes, that's true. And then when I was in school, when I came home from school, I would write a poem. And I thought that is a very natural thing. And I remember when I came from school with a friend of mine in my class, and we went home and I said to him, are you going to write a poem now? And so he said, what do you say? And I was surprised, because I thought everybody would go home and write a poem. So but he would go play football or something. No, but then later on, I continued to write poetry for the rest of my life, I think. Not every day, but quite often and quite a lot of time,
How was your being a poet interwoven with other things in your life? Do you have another perspective on life because you're writing poetry, except for when you were coming home you wrote a poem and not playing football? How do you think?
No, I was writing poetry, but I never considered myself a poet. I knew some poets in Holland whom I admired. I went to a poetry reading when I was at school with some famous Dutch poets, and I never thought of myself being one of them. So that was a different kind of people. So I wrote poetry, but I went to school, I finished school, I went to study medicine and then became a doctor. And still at that time, I would never say I'm a poet, and so that is a different kind of person. But later on, when I started publishing, of course, yes. But even I found it very easy when people ask me, what are you? I would always say I'm a doctor. I didn't have to say anything else. And still nowadays when somebody asks me, what are you? I would say, yeah, I'm a doctor. I used to be a doctor. So. But not a poet or a writer. But if somebody asks me, are you a poet? I would say, yes. Yes.
We are privileged to be in that secret society of people who know that you're a poet. So now Slovene translation.
Torej, za tiste med vami, ki raje poslušate slovenščino, bom na kratko prevedla. Pesnik, ki ga gostimo, je začel pesmi pisati pri 15 letih in Tina ga je vprašala, ali je res, da je takrat, ko je začel pisati pesmi, tudi vsak dan napisal eno pesem. Odvrnil je, da se je res tako začelo, ko je hodil v šolo, je nekako bilo naravno, da ko se je vrnil domov, je napisal pesem. In da tudi dojemal svet tako, da se je zdelo, kot da vsi pišejo pesmi. In ko je vprašal svoje sošolce, boš zdaj ti napisal pesem, ko prideš domov, je bil tisti človek zelo začuden. In tudi njemu se je zdelo nenavadno, da ne pišejo vsi pesmi, ampak počnejo tudi kaj drugega. Na to je sledilo vprašanje, kako je biti pesnik povezano z njegovim življenjem nasploh, torej kako je to vplivalo na njegovo življenje. In pojasnil je, da se pravzaprav nikoli ni imel prvenstveno za pesnika, temveč najprej samo za pisca pesmi, nekoga, ki piše pesmi. In da je v bistvu, ko je spoznaval pesnike, ko je hodil na pesniška branja, od začetka sploh ni čutil, kot da bi bil del te skupnosti. Šele ko je začel izdajati knjige, je pravzaprav začutil, da je tudi pesnik. Sicer pa je doštudiral medicino, je doktor medicine. In tudi, ko ga ljudje vprašajo, kaj je po poklicu, najprej reče zdravnik. Torej nekdanji zdravnik, ampak če ga vprašamo, ali je pesnik, bo seveda rekel, da tudi pesnik sem.
And I'm also very happy that with us is also Mateja Seliškar Kenda, who did a fascinating work by translating a collection of poems by Toon Tellegen in Slovenian. Mateja, experts on Toon Tellegen's work agree that, if I quote, his work occupies a unique place in Dutch literature. Indeed, it defies comparison with that of any other Dutch poet and should perhaps be seen in a broader European context. What is your opinion on that? You're an expert on Dutch literature. How do you see Toon Tellegen's work in this context?
Well, I would say that not only his poetry, but entire work occupies a special, has a unique place in the Dutch literature. In a way, if we concentrate now on the poetry, in a way I think there are visible traces, I could say, of experimental poets from the 50s. There was a very important poetry group movement in Holland that we call the Vijftigers, and there are really some very important Dutch poets that made a revolution in their poetry, like Remco Kampert, Lucebert. And with that tradition, I would say that in a way we can see the experiment that this neo-avant-garde movement launched at that time, that experimenting with words, experimenting with the meaning of words, placing the words in an untraditional manner, searching new association between the words. This kind of playfulness, I would say that it's not like it's an influence. It has his poetry has this traces of this experimental poetry. But however, if we look at it, that movement, neo-avant-garde movement, was rebellious movement, was very critical movement. Whereas Mr. Tellegen's poetry is much softer. It's kind to the humankind, if you know what I mean. I mean, he's in constant dialogue with the reader, with himself also, but with the reader. He points to the reader the questions that probably cross every man's mind in a certain phase of his life. Mm-hmm. And he also addresses the question that should be asked in a certain phase of human life. Mm-hmm. And I think this is the distinction. I mean, the Dutch poetry can be pretty harsh. Mm-hmm. For Slovene reader. This is also a quality of his entire work. This softness, this subtle, very, I don't know, really kind literature that addresses the Slovenian reader, mm-hmm. Maybe more than some more direct Dutch poet or writer. Mm-hmm. So I think this is the unique characteristics in the Dutch literature. Mm-hmm. Where it comes from, I don't know.
Where does it come from?
Well, I don't know. No. Yeah, what is this influence of the 50s, of the movement of the 50s? That is obvious. I think it's in almost every poet in Holland has been influenced by this movement. This is the central movement in the Dutch literature until maybe 20 years ago. And so I was when I was in school, this 50s movement was, these poets were about 15 years older than I am, and but they still were very young when I was at school, and with my friends at school and the teachers, we were wild about these poets and so on. And when I went to this first reading of poets, I was one of them, was one of the 50s leading poets, and so I was definitely influenced by them. Yes, yeah. But then, yeah, the qualities, it's very difficult to say what when you write poetry, what the qualities of your poetry are. Yes, yeah, yeah.
Torej, predstavili smo Matejo Seliškar Kenda, prevajalko, ki je prevedla pesniško zbirko Toona Tellegena. in je strokovnjakinja za nizozemsko književnost nasploh. Predvsem je vprašala Mateja, kaj je tisto, Tina vprašala Mateja, kaj je tisto, kar daje njegovemu delu poseben pečat, kako je umeščeno v nizozemsko književnost, ker naj bi imel nekakšno unikatno mesto v nizozemski književnosti. In strinjala se je kot strokovnjakinja in kot prevajalka, ki se je z njegovim delom ukvarjala, da njegovo delo res ima neko svojstveno mesto in da kljub temu, da so v njem močno vidne sledi in da je zaznamovano z eksperimentalnim pesniškim gibanjem iz 50-ih let, neoavantgardnim gibanjem, da je kljub temu zanj značilno nekaj posebnega, se pravi, da je njegova poezija veliko mehkejša, veliko prijaznejša in na ta način morda tudi bližja slovenskemu bralcu, zato ker nizozemska poezija nasploh zna biti precej groba in nekako trša. On pa vzpostavlja prijazen, prijeten dialog z bralcem, postavlja vprašanja, ki si jih vsi zastavljamo ali pa takšna, ki bi si jih vsi morali zastavljati in na nek način hkrati ima vplive tega gibanja, so vidni, po drugi strani pa ima tudi nekaj povsem svojevrstnega in samo svojega. Potem je sledilo vprašanje, odkot ta posebnost in odkot ti vplivi, pa nihče ne ve. Pravzaprav potem pesnik ugiba, da dejansko je bil močno zaznamovan z tem gibanjem pesniškim, ki se je začelo v 50-ih letih in trajalo do pred 20 leti na Nizozemskem, ker je to bilo najmočnejše gibanje, tudi to so bili tisti prvi pesniki, ki jih je kot mlad študent spoznaval, na katerih branja je hodil in da jih je pravzaprav oboževal tako on kot njegovi vrstniki in profesori. Tako da vpliv vsekakor je.
Talking of influences, the experts on your poetry list several, but all agree on one, and that is your grandfather. Would you be prepared to tell us more about your grandfather? He must have been a fascinating figure.
Well, my grandfather, from my mother's side, so his name was not Tellegen, came from a family, originally Dutch family, but who had been trading with Russia since the 17th century. And so my great-great-grandfather was already selling, he had a shop in St. Petersburg, he was selling a little stick from Java to Potemkin, who came to us, the lover of Catherine the Great. And my great-great-grandfather was, he had a school where the Tsars would come and visit and so on. And in the beginning they moved from Holland to Russia and back, but finally, at last in the middle of the 19th century, they stayed in Russia, they lived there. And they were trading, and my grandfather had a trading company, not a shop, but a trading company and he traded things, and he had in the Gostiny Dvor on the Nevsky Prospect in St. Petersburg. And his family, and he married a woman from the Baltic states, and so with my grandmother he talked German because she was originally German speaking, but with his children, with my mother, their language was Russian. And so and then in 1918, because of the revolution, they lost everything and they had to move, and they finally came back. They came back to Holland. My grandfather was quite poor at that time. He had lost everything, and he had to go along the shops with a suitcase trying to sell sweets to shopkeepers, and so they had a very poor life. But still, they always, my grandfather always said, next spring we'll go back to Russia. So he was always dreaming about Russia, and they talked Russian. So with my brothers and sister, when we didn't know any Russian, but we would imitate Russian. So I remember sitting with my brothers saying "Schnufzi, schnufzi," and all the time we would play this kind of Russian language and so on. And so, but my grandfather died when I was 13, and so, and he had been writing himself although he never published anything. He was a very religious man. He wrote poems about God and Christ, but also little plays and jokes and things both in Russian and in German and in Dutch, in 3 languages and so. But was never published, and I only later on found out about it. And when I knew him as a child, he was very, very pessimistic. He was down, but he was a man who had a big, what we call the Russian beard, which goes to 2 directions, and he was blind, and he would, when I would come there as a child, he would put his hand on my head and bless me like Isaac would bless Jacob instead of Esau. And so, and in my mind, he lived always on, and so on. I started to write stories. I wrote a book with stories that he might have told me about Russia. And I wrote a long poem about a train where my mother, my grandfather, and me were riding in that train, and we're sitting there and things happen and so on. So that's, and because of him and because of the background of my mother, from a very early age, I began to read Russian literature and translation. I never spoke any Russian, but and still up to now, I love Russian literature, and I've read a lot of it, and and it might have influence. And especially some of the stories of Harms and so on, and the group who lived shortly after the revolution, when it was still possible to write something absurd in Russia until Stalin came along, and it was impossible. Those people that have probably influenced me, yes. Yeah.
You mentioned Daniil Harms,
yes,
and also the critics see in your poetry as well the possible influence or some similarity with Harms, with Bulgakov. But your personal favorite, if I learned correctly, of the Russian authors is Chekhov.
Chekhov, yes.
Exactly, with his softness, gentleness.
Yes. Chekhov is my absolute favorite, yes. Yes.
What? Can we translate?
You can translate, yes.
Torej, strokovnjaki se strinjajo tudi, kar se tiče vplivov, da je nanj in na njegovo